So my name is Sonya Winterberg. I am a freelance journalist originally from Finland, and I live in Canada now. And let me maybe start with my slideshow. I will try and share the screen, and then we can sort of take it from there. Just bear with me a minute as we sort of try to get that worked out. So here we are. So in 2016, I attended a conference in Odessa sponsored by the German Foreign Office that brought together filmmakers from Ukraine and Germany under the headline, The Eyes of Society. To this day, I like this title as it rings true in so many ways. Media workers from all types of media indeed are the eyes of societies. And as such, we have principles to adhere to and responsibilities vis-a-vis our audience. I will talk about that in a minute. For me, Europe was always bigger than the European Union. Being from Finland, I was acutely aware of the role Russia played in European geopolitics, as did the Baltic states and many of Russia's neighbors. Ukraine, on the other hand, for me was a country of great fascination. Just take Odessa as one of the birthplaces of modern Jewish literature. When Ukraine co-hosted the Eurosoccer 2012 and Europeans could simply drive to Lviv or Kiev, it seemed we had moved closer together once again. Like probably most Ukrainians, I was eager to see the association agreement with the EU signed and was dismayed when your government decided otherwise. I don't need to spell out what followed: the Euromaidan, the Ukrainian Revolution, and eventually Putin's annexation of Crimea, followed by the war in the Donbass. So when I came to Odessa in 2016, I was curious to see what the world felt like for young people in Ukraine. What were their hopes and dreams? What would their future look like? I learned a lot more than I can possibly cover in my talk today. But what was most wonderful was the hospitality and the sharing of their stories. Less than 20 years after the Balkan conflict, a major conflict in Europe after World War II, the war in the Donbass meant another generation of young Europeans had learned that war is a reality. Almost all of the participants in the conference had stories to tell of friends in the Ukrainian army, of family affected by the conflict, and a couple even had left the region after the fighting broke out. It was and still is heartbreaking. What is even more concerning to me is the way Russia, and on another note, China as well, are using every possible means to destabilize entire regions and thus extending their own realm of power. One of the first visits to Odessa grew out of that first visit to Odessa grew friendships, collaborations, and a project that I want to briefly talk about. Dark business, child trafficking in the heart of Europe, followed the money in one of the most lucrative sectors of organized crime. After dealing with arms and narcotics, humans are third in commodities being traded on the black market as well as on the dark net. Together with a colleague, I was looking into ways especially children were taken out of the country. We found out that the demand of children as young as 3 years old and teenage girls was huge in Germany, for example, France, and Central Europe being really one of the major markets for slave labor and for pornography production and for exploitation, sexual exploitation. The way into the European Union was mainly through the southern border with Romania and Moldova. Among the traffickers were corrupt workers in NGOs that were funded by the European Union and OECD, who seemingly helped traffic victims, but ran brothels on the side as well. let me show you a brief introduction of that film. I just need to, I guess, stop the screen sharing for a minute and then redo it. Let me just try to find that here. So, and that is a little hard to do. I'm not sure how I can do that. No, I need to leave you. Just a second, I'm sorry. So let's see here. So now we can go to desktop.
The child as a commodity is a European problem.
Europäisches Problem.
It happens at our doorstep, right in front of us.
It's a huge problem because of the relatively easy money that it generates.
I was the pick of the bunch, the sweet little girl from next door. There were way too many men. Young women whose will was broken are marked for life.
Die sind fürs Leben gezeichnet.
Had I refused, they would have killed me.
It's a problem deeply rooted in our society. Everyone looks away.
My biggest social injustice, what I see, is people in modern day slavery.
This is just to give you a brief idea of the film or of the topic that we were dealing with. And let me go back to the slides now. The work in Ukraine was truly wonderful, and let me just share that screen again. So here we go. So we had a very professional team of Ukrainian women, a camera woman, a wonderful stringer, journalist colleagues who helped us in different cities. And so we traveled from Izmail in the south to Odessa and Kherson, to Kharkov in the east, and finally to Kiev. Meeting with victims of child trafficking was hard, but we were never in any danger. However, we reported some of the NGOs that we found were obviously corrupt to their funders. Corruption and trafficking goes hand in hand with conflict and a dysfunctional rule of law. An organized crime can even be found pretty much anywhere, even in sort of modern day democracies, like the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta and others have shown. Our work, the work of journalists, is not popular with those in power and those acting in the shadows. And that is where the danger of reporting really begins. So Sergei asked me to talk a little bit about my work and how I sort of, how I usually work and what I do. And so I'm basically known as a journalist mostly in Germany, who coined the term slow journalism. And it came out of the realization that we worked mostly to satisfy deadlines. Journalists in the print media and broadcasting came under huge economic pressure starting in the 1990s and early 2000s. Digitization added to the pressure and took away the capacity of journalists to devote time to any one topic. We were juggling several stories under tremendous pressure all the time. and the quality suffered greatly. This is when I changed the way I worked and decided that I will try and find ways to report in topics that I care about in the amount of time needed. I focused on war and trauma and reported on issues like the aftermath of the war in Bosnia, the Kashmir earthquake in 2005, Hurricane Katrina in the United States, and the resettlement of refugees and internally displaced persons to villages across Afghanistan. To this day, I strongly believe that as a journalist, you should not further traumatize the victims of trauma you report on. What sounds very obvious is a concept not widely accepted in the media. We're supposed to pull stories from strangers who sometimes have lost everything in a very short amount of time. This goes against my understanding of humanity. First and foremost, I'm a compassionate human being, and second, I'm a journalist. The stories I file, the films I make are better because of it. And in short, that means giving the story the time it needs. Listening to the stories that people tell us with intent to understand what they're telling us and not with the intent just to produce the next headline. And it also means to show respect, as it is their story, it's usually their drama, it's their traumatic experience. And I try to give them agency, which basically means they have lost control over a major part of their life. And the least we can do is give them back some agency, which, for example, means that they share as much or as little as they want or can at any given moment. So if we then look at investigative journalism, and that was part of what I will talk about later in my investigation about the murder of Anja Niedringhaus, investigative reporting is similar in that we investigate a single topic of interest, such as serious crime, political corruption, or corporate wrongdoing. An investigative journalist may spend months or years researching and preparing a report. In-depth coverage of complex stories in underserved communities, like attacks on and murder of journalists, are at the heart of our profession. We all should have each other's safety in mind and make sure to make attacks public, like Maria reported earlier, the Justice for Journalism Foundation does. And if we do not make them public, nobody else will. And that is really sort of is something that I really try to tell colleagues wherever I go, is if you know about colleagues being harassed, if you know about colleagues sort of being the target of an attack, make it public, even if they may be not able to do it themselves. If we as journalists do not take care of this part of our work, nobody else will. Sergei asked me also to talk a little bit about basic protection. How can we protect ourselves? And I always found that, like in many other instances, education is one of the best protections. We need to learn about the environment that we go into. We need to find the resources that help us understand stories or understand areas of conflict. There is a great resource in Europe. There are many others, but I just have one that I really recommend because I find their materials really useful. And it's the Dark Center. They have a European agency as well. So if you go to their internet site, you'll find resources that can help to better understand the challenges we sometimes face and how to deal with them. Another sort of very important part, and Maria mentioned it as well, is hostile environment and emergency first aid training. There are different sort of focuses. There's HEFAD and HEAD and HEAT. You might have heard of some of them. I have found that really sort of, no matter if you're from an area of conflict, if you're from a country that is used to war, or if you're from a place that is very peaceful, you can gain from going through these trainings. They're anywhere from 2 to 6, and sometimes I think even 8 or 9 days. There's a lot of international organizations, and part of that also Justice for Journalists does that sponsor these kind of trainings. And what I would recommend to any of you is really, if just given the situation that you're in Ukraine, and with sort of Russia being on your doorsteps and nobody really knowing what will happen the next couple of years, go and get this training, even if you don't sort of feel you're in need of it right now. It helps even in the long term. I even found it helpful, for example, during right-wing demonstrations in Germany where I was attacked. It just really helps you to gain insight in how to best prepare and work around and be safe in dangerous situations. Another very sort of obvious and still sometimes hard to come by part of basic protection is protection gear. If it's a gun-proof vest, if it's a helmet, you know, they cost a lot of money. But again, there's organizations like Reporter Without Borders where you can either borrow them. There's news organizations who sometimes hand them out on loan. Again, sort of if you're just even thinking about going anywhere on a front line, going without this part like protective gear, it just really endangers you more. And if you have a ways of getting that, it really should be taken seriously and taken. And even if you're not targeted directly, you know, a bomb can go off, there can be stray bullets, all kinds of things. Just make sure that you are protected. By the same token, if we talk about places under Islamic rule, if Afghanistan being one of them, but even going into Pakistan or parts of India like Kashmir or Iran, local attire is a major problem. It's sort of, especially sort of in the Western world, many women feel that putting on a headscarf already sort of diminishes their value as a woman, and it's against feminist ideas. I've always found that if you adjust to the environment that you're working on, you are able to relate with people much more easier, and it really helps in opening doors. And so again, that's can also be a protection, that people who understand that you're willing to adjust and adapt to their ways for a certain period of time, especially when you're reporting, they will also help protect you. And so I think it cannot be stressed enough how important it is to dress as the locals do wherever you go. And last but not least, insurance is a matter that that really, I think, especially in countries where money is an issue, should really be taken out. And there's international insurances, like, for example, Reporters Without Borders. They have an international office in France, where they insure all journalists that are registered as members. And it's for a very small sum. I think it's about $40 a year. And that sort of helps to defray costs that might be related to an attack. It helps when you're being abducted. All these kind of instances that no regular insurance helps you with. So if you are a journalist, a reporter, a media worker, try and get coverage to help, especially your families, to deal with any costs that may be come up during whatever situation of crisis that you might find yourself in. Another sort of part that I want to talk about is colleagues. And sometimes we feel that colleagues are our competition. And when in fact, there is safety in numbers. Even if you're working on a very sort of a dear story or important story, and you feel that sort of you you don't want to share the story with somebody, make sure that your colleagues know where you're going, what you're reporting on, what your work is sort of roughly about, so that if you go missing, for example, or if there are any problems, that they know what you're up to or where you were. And that really sort of is something that especially young people, young journalists sometimes are afraid of. And I can just, again, encourage sort of the sharing. And if you're a good colleague, you don't run with a colleague's story. You really make sure that they are, that they get all the support in reporting the story that they're trying to cover. And then sort of lastly, make sure that your mental health is taken care of. Again, especially among men who are reporting from war zones, it is not very sort of popular, especially in some cultures, to talk about that. As you might know, sort of drinking is a huge problem among journalists in conflict zones, as is medication, the use of medication. And so just make sure that you debrief your experiences in the field with colleagues and mental health professionals. Again, this sounds very basic. Sometimes it just helps if at the end of the day, you're able to talk to somebody on the phone, on WhatsApp, on sort of any way that you can communicate, and just tell them what you saw or heard that day, things that impacted you. And yeah, so I think that really for me has always been really important to get out of my system the hard things that I see or hear. And even in sort of when you're at home, it helps if you prepare for these situations by keeping a certain health regimen that includes sports. And for some people it's meditation, for others it's yoga, and again, others they just need a good work-life balance. You know, do things that you enjoy, because you can only be good in your job if you have something outside of it that's worth living for. And again, sort of mental health is at the core. Many of the of journalists and veteran journalists report that it has been the hardest in their work when they have lost colleagues, when they had to face mutilated bodies. These are the things that stay with you. These are the things you might dream about. That's something that you're not being paid for. And so keeping yourself sane is really an important part of our work. And then if we go into basically the advanced ways to protect ourselves in our work, there are some things we can still do or that are kind of like making it better, but many of them are also associated again with money. So I would always recommend try to get your bases covered with the basics, and if you have ways to get the advanced protection in place, go for it. So one that seems very obvious is communication. If you have the possibility to ensure your own ability to communicate at all times, for example, with satellite phones, that is key. You know, it's sort of, there's a lot of areas, and especially in conflict, but even if like governments can just you know, take communications, like internet communications, like cell phone coverage, they can take that out. And if you are not able to communicate, that takes away not only your ability to report, but also puts your safety in danger. Also make sure that you have lifelines. Make sure you have people who, if they don't hear from you within a certain time frame, know what to do. You know, they know who to call, who is your commissioning editor, who are the people who would then start looking for you. Bigger news organizations, and that's unfortunately mostly available to them, they do have critical event management. They have third parties that are taking care of rescue operations, recovery operations, and just if you can sort of either collaborate or get an assignment by a bigger news organization, that usually also helps in moments of crises. To have a pullout and evacuation plan in place is something that many don't feel is really necessary, because of course we're coming back. Sometimes security situations can deteriorate faster than we can anticipate. And for that reason alone, it's always good to have an idea what could be the worst case scenario, and how do I get myself removed from such a situation. And last but not least, the support for family members. Most of us are not an island. Most of us do have families, have friends, we have mothers, we have children, we have husbands, we have wives. And for them, it's also very stressful if we go into these situations. They might not always show us that, but in the long term, there is, and we know that from several studies, there is a price for them to pay as well. And so to make sure that that they know what your plans are roughly, that they know where you're going, and what will happen if the worst case scenario happens, what they should do. And so that means really working with them around making plans, making them aware of wishes that you have, and this can be anything from, do you want to be, if something happens to you, like where do you want to be treated? How do you want to be treated? Do you want to have resuscitation? Do you want to have, put an estate for your children in place? Things like really sort of planning for your own injury or even death. And it sounds really macabre, and it's something that we don't like to talk about. But I think it's really important that we go into these situations with a clear head that there is always a possibility of us not coming back. And that's not what we plan for. But if we have a plan in place, it might actually help those around us. So let me now come to the case of Anja Niedringhaus. Anja Niedringhaus was a Pulitzer Prize winner, a photographer for the Associated Press, certainly the most prominent German war photographer, and just a really great colleague. And we met in 2008 through mutual colleagues. And she was introduced to me as a role model for newswire photographers across the globe. And she had a picture impact of 75%, meaning a photo that she had taken, if it was in Bosnia or in Iraq or Afghanistan, would be on 75% of the world's newspaper on any given day. And so if it was the New York Times, or if it was Pravda, or, like many of the papers in the Middle East, even in China, they would take her pictures on the front page, as the Associated Press furnished them. And so when she was killed in Afghanistan, and I will show you a little clip in a moment, I was just, I was shocked. I was shocked, like how somebody who did all the right things, how that could happen to her. And so let me now share you that the teaser for my documentary about Anja. And again, I have to stop share and then find another screen to share. So just bear with me for a minute.
Vorstellen, dass 1950 noch im Frieden gewesen rumlaufen. Und das möchte ich auch.
Going to Afghanistan, but she had a passion for it. Oh, I said, shut up, I'm fine.
Anja would get angry sometimes if she thought she wasn't getting the picture she wanted.
Combination of Anja and Kathy is a pretty powerful combination. So if they get an idea in their heads, it's difficult to challenge that.
She worked immense courage, both of them, Kathy and Anja. They went places few people would dare go.
There's so many moments that were just so much about us and about our connection that it was like nobody else existed.
Photographer Anja Niedringhaus hinterließ die deutsche Fotoreporterin.
The thoughts and prayers of the First Lady and the President go out to the family of Anja Niedringhaus, who was killed in Afghanistan overnight.
Anja was killed instantly while Kathy was rushed to a hospital.
AFP Anja.
A lot about people, by the way they laugh, I think.
Then that evening, we were out on the balcony here and having a couple of glasses of wine, and we started talking. And it was as if we'd known each other forever. I mean, as if we had known each other forever.
A lot of journalists fall in love, right, in these places, and there's a reason why. You need that human experience, right? You cry a lot, you need to laugh, and you need to introduce some kind of normality into your life at these times to be able to survive it.
Close my eyes and I see your smile. I close my eyes and I hear you laugh. We were a hell of a team. I remember some of your last words. I am so happy you said, I love you, my Charles. I miss you.
So let me go back to my presentation. And then we add so I applied for funding for investigating the attack on Anja Niedringhaus because there were no colleagues that reported beyond the fact that she had died, that there was an attack on a police car, on the car that she was traveling in with her colleague Kathy Gannon from the AP. Beyond the news that this had happened and that the gunman was apprehended, there was no investigation from any journalists. And so when we look at the official responses, you would think that her home country of Germany would have done anything or would have done sort of an investigation. And indeed, they started a criminal investigation, the German federal police did, essentially reporting back to the Foreign Office what they learned from their Afghan counterparts. The EU on then again sort of dealing with matters that go beyond a single state or that happen essentially outside of Germany. There was no reaction at all. They found it was an issue of the member state of Germany. We had, as you saw in the film, in the clip, the US mention the attack during the White House daily press briefing, but there was no, at least no public investigation. And the US would also have sort of had an interest in the situation because the Associated Press is an American newswire agency based in New York City. Again, the US did not investigate. The same goes for Canada. Kathy Gannon, the colleague who survived the attack, is originally from Canada. She is married to a man from Pakistan, and she lives in Islamabad, Pakistan. But she's Canadian national, and I don't know, I would have expected at least for some diplomatic involvement that they would start an investigation. So then Afghanistan, I mean, they apprehended the attacker. They had a murder to present to the world, and it was an open and shut case. So he was deemed mentally ill, or that's at least what they try to sell. And they said it is a lone attacker. He was mentally disturbed. He got the death penalty, which by modern day sort of standards, if we have a mentally disturbed person, he or she would probably not stand trial because he or she would be not deemed capable of standing trial. So after the death penalty was passed, the sentence was reduced to 20 years in prison. And I don't know, I as much as many of our colleagues who didn't do anything about it, but they were asking them, who was behind that murder? Was it really a lone attacker? And that is really where my investigation started, even before I requested assistance from Justice for Journalists. I cannot really tell you much about the final results of the investigation, as we have not yet published it, but I can tell you a little bit of the context and where we stand today. So I think the major news for me was that in 2018, I interviewed former President Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan, and he told me that it was impossible for the attacker ever to be pardoned. That there was no such provision in Afghan law, and that sort of felt at least sort of right, because if you then further down the road understand why he did what he did, and that much I can say, he was not a lone wolf and he was not mentally disturbed. Then you wonder why in early 2021, so this year, he was released. He was the attacker was released in the early months of this year as part of a negotiated prisoner exchange of the Taliban with the Americans in Qatar. You might have heard about these negotiations, and they basically preceded the withdrawal of the Allied forces from Afghanistan. that then ended up in a really difficult situation with the Taliban taking over the whole country in August, ahead of the Allied forces leaving Afghanistan. So when the Taliban came to power, they eventually freed all prisoners, regardless of the crimes they had committed. So at the latest by then, he would have come free anyways. But it just goes to show that there was a big network that had a big interest in this person, and it came quite as a shock, especially to the family, that he had been released early this year. So when we talk about the safety of women journalists around the globe, women journalists and female media workers face attacks both offline and online, and they're putting their safety at risk. And these attacks can range from violence and stigmatization to sexist hate speech, trolling, physical assault, rape, and even murder. In addition to being targeted on the basis of their work as journalists, women are also the targets of gender-based violence. Studies have shown that female journalists are targeted online significantly more than their male colleagues, and that the threats they face are highly sexualized, focused on their physical features, ethnicity, cultural background, and very rarely on the content of their work. As a result, these threats tend to silence women journalists' voices and deplete freedom of speech by interrupting valuable investigative journalist work. They also distort the media landscape by threatening diversity and perpetuating inequalities both in newsrooms and in societies. So what I find always helpful, and we talked about that a little earlier, is really capacity building. There's a number of ways of building capacity in that regard. So under an initiative, for example, of UNESCO, the International Women's Media Foundation, IWMF, and the University of Texas at Austin's Knight Center for Journalism launched a joint massive open online project called How to Report Safely, a guide for women journalists and their allies. And that is still available online under this web address that I just posted. And it's a self-directed course. So if you speak English, I encourage you to, and you're a woman, I encourage you to go and use resources like this to help yourself better deal with situations where you are being harassed or violated. Also, awareness raising is something that I feel male colleagues can do. If you work in newsrooms or if you have work in a journalists union, if you're engaged in any way, shape or form, working, doing more than just your daily job, learn about the global trends in online violence against women journalists. There's a wonderful discussion paper out that was just recently published. If you Google the chilling global trends in online violence, you will get that report. And I found that really eye-opening, and it can help also, really encourage colleagues to keep one another safe. And then I've often been asked, and again, Sergey asked the question to me as well, how can we respond to online hate and harassment? And I think that the most important thing is that we report incidents. There's a number of ways the basic thing is really that we start out with is don't feed the troll. Don't sort of continue engaging with people who are posting hateful comments, for example. Instead, try really sort of to record and report. Record all important information about the incident, including the perpetrator, who is the person. Record what was said or shared and when the incident happened. You might not need it at that very moment and you try to brush it off, but it might come in handy later, because sometimes these incidents, they're not just they don't only occur once, they sometimes come in waves. And so if you can go back and say, oh, well, this happened already a year ago, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, it helps you to build a case. Also record how the content made you feel and why you think hate was the motivation. And that doesn't mean that this has to hold up in a court of law. It basically means to help you get, again, the bad energy out of your system, and to make sure that sometimes the things that we write on paper help us to validate and to say this actually happened. Also, keep original messages or content or a copy if possible. Make a screenshot. Sometimes people, especially like on Twitter or on social media, later they withdraw whatever they said or posted. Make a screenshot, then you have evidence. Also contact administrators of apps or sites and give them the details if you can. They can only, any system, especially like Twitter and Facebook and all these kind of social media platforms, they can only be as good as the information they're being given. Also, if you're if you have the possibility to contact the police or a third-party reporting center, contact them, especially if you believe violence may occur as a result of the incidents. Oftentimes we don't take things seriously in the beginning, and they escalate. And if there has been a previous record of you contacting the police, of contacting authorities, of contacting third-party reporting centers, like journalist organizations, like the Justice for Journalists Project, like there's many other sort of international journalism organizations out there. Again, you build a case, and that's what is needed. So finally, let me talk briefly about conflict-sensitive journalism. My very dear Canadian colleague, Ross Howard, once said, professional journalists do not set out to reduce conflicts. They seek to present accurate and impartial news. But it is often through good reporting that conflict is reduced. So what he means, or what it means, is basically that we are not politicians, we are not soldiers, we are not the ones who are in charge of reducing or make the conflict go away. But what we can do is to present, and that's really important, and it seems to be more important than ever, we can present accurate and impartial news. And that is then sort of a consequence of that can be that conflict eventually is being reduced. So some principles that I want to mention briefly is that we don't share bare facts. So many journalists today recognize that we are more than just professional spectators and distributors of facts. We are aware that other people know how to create facts for us to report, and they have a media strategy. So we try to put things in context. If politicians choose certain facts to tell the media, to use the media to influence the public's views of a conflict, we need to counter that with putting these news in context. If we only report the bare facts about violent conflict, citizens will only understand the conflict in those terms. But if we search for news beyond the bare facts, if we present more information to citizens, including possible solutions, they may see the conflict also in different terms. So for example, if a car bomb went off yesterday, we should not just report that there was a car bomb and repeat what everybody else says about it. We should report how it affected ordinary people's lives and seek their opinions about the conflict. We should also report on new attempts to end the conflict and provide information which exposes the bare facts. other points that are sort of important is that we avoid reporting what political leaders want us to report. Press conferences, news conferences are great. You get the basic information, but that is not the final stage of our reporting. Also make sure that you never just report on one side of the conflict. And that's especially hard if you're a party of a conflict. You know that I'm talking about Ukraine. Of course, you have your party to the conflict, and so how could you, for example, report on the Russian side? But make sure that you look at it from almost like an eagle's eyes perspective, from above the country. Quote those affected rather than judge a situation yourself, because again, you might be biased. Avoid any words that are giving you that show or that are biased, again, like terrorist, like extremist, like fanatic. These words are taking sides, and we make the other side seem impossible to negotiate with. Call people what they call themselves. If they call themselves patriots, call them patriots, or say the person who called him or herself a patriot. And avoid making an opinion, if it's their opinion or if it's your opinion, a fact. You have heard lots about fake news in recent years. It's a major problem within our industry that people try to report their own opinions as facts. So if someone claims something, state their name so it is their opinion and not your fact. And as I said earlier, try and be a human first and a journalist second. As journalists, our most powerful tools are the words we use and the pictures we broadcast. We can use our tools to build understanding instead of spreading fears or spreading myths. So let me come to an end here, to my conclusions. And they're very basic, and I said some of them I already said earlier in my presentation. So no story, no picture is worth your life. Don't endanger yourself in ways that you knowingly put yourself in danger. It can happen that you're in a dangerous situation. If you go into a war zone, of course there is danger, but don't sort of try and get the best picture or try to report something where you knowingly put yourself in grave danger. Nothing is worth your life. Be kind to yourself and others. And I mean that literally to your colleagues, to the people that you meet, people that are difficult, soldiers, authorities, whoever you're gonna meet, they're human too. And so don't just instrumentalize them for your gain. Try to be a good person. It sounds kitschy or just maybe also weird, but I really found it goes a long way, especially in situations where people are stressed on all sides and where a lack of food, lack of water, lack of sanitation, noise, loud sort of environments, bombings, etc. When you're in these environments, it helps you the most if you stay kind and compassionate with yourself and others. Reporting is more than just sharing news. I think I made that clear. Again, context is important, and we just need to be aware of everything that's going on around the news, and just make sure that you report on that as well. 2 more points. Professionalism over patriotism. As reporters and as news makers and as storytellers, we can help bridge divides between opposing sides, especially when we search for stories about what is common to both sides. Hate and friction and divide is something that is used, and it's used on people and it's used on journalists. And I often hear that it also especially in Canada and in Germany, that people are longing for good news. And that is even more true so in conflict. And if you can find those stories that give hope and that sort of that sort of are not just part of a big sort of telling of all evil, you will find that over time it makes a difference. Finally, help to remove stereotypes and assumptions from our news. A lot of times we are quick to decide who is the good and who is the bad, and we report accordingly. Ask yourself if a story can be reported differently. I sometimes do that with journalism students, that I let them write stories from different perspectives. And it's something that we can even do if you write up a story, that we can make sure that we report it as sort of objectively as possible. And we can do that by not sort of portraying soldiers, for example, as the evil or as the enemy, and just report them as what they are. Finally, and that's what I would like to end with, reliable journalism is at the core of our jobs. And reliable journalism means that it is accurate, that it is balanced, and that it is responsible. So thank you so much for having me here today and talking about these important topics with you.